Buonasera a tutti, benvenuti a questo seminario online SISEC, webinar, anzi, è la prima dopo le vacanze, quindi benvenuti tutti. Inizio brevemente in italiano per innanzitutto ringraziare i nostri ospiti oggi, Marius Busemeyer e Emmanuele Pavolini, ma di loro parlerò dopo. Adesso volevo semplicemente brevemente ricordarvi i prossimi seminari di questo ciclo. Avremo lunedì 24 ottobre, sempre in questo orario con questa stessa formula, la presentazione di un altro libro su un tema simile, La mano invisibile dello Stato sociale, a cura di Matteo Iesula e il nostro qui presente Emmanuele Pavolini. E poi avremo un'altra presentazione di libro il 7 novembre, sempre in questo formato. Avremo la presentazione del volume di Chiara Saraceno, David Benassi ed Enrica Morlicchio sulla povertà in Italia. Qui ospiti di Discute saranno David De Bubbico e Manuela Nannini. Quindi stay tuned, come si dice, con la SISEC per i web. Now let us move to English and let me welcome our guest, Marius Busemeyer. Marius is a professor of political science in the University of Cologne, of Konstanz in Germany. It's actually the part of Germany which is closer to Italy, so just 4 hours drive from Milan. Marius has an MA at the University of Heidelberg, a Master of Public Administration from Harvard Kennedy School of Government. He's a PhD in political science from the University of Heidelberg, and he got habilitated in Cologne. Then his career moved to Cologne at the Max Planck Institute, and then he went to Konstanz, where he's full professor of political science since 2011. He has been visiting scholar and visiting professor in a number of universities and got a lot of grants, both German and European and international. His work has been on the welfare state, and particularly he has been a pioneer in the comparative study of vocational training. You know, in welfare state research, typically education has been kind of neglected. And unfortunately, because education is perhaps the oldest part of the welfare state. He has written a lot of books, among which I will show you a couple: The Political Economy of Skills Formation, which is an edited book, very important for the comparative study of vocational training system, and Skills and Inequality. I highly recommend both books to our friends because they are really a reference point for the comparative study of education. Okay, this is all from me. I now thank you very much, Marius, for being here with us, and I leave him the floor to present this book. Marius, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Gabriele, for the nice introduction, and thank you, of course, for the invitation to be here with you, even though just virtually. But this is a great opportunity, of course, to also discuss across disciplinary boundaries, which I think is extremely important. So I'm sharing my screen, and I hope it works. If not, then you just have to yell. And I want to, or I've been invited to introduce yet another book that just came out recently, and it's on the relationship between digitalization and the welfare state. And I should, from the start, say this is a collaborative work. I edited this with Achim Kemmerling from University of Erfurt, Paul Marx from the University of Duisburg, and Kees van Kersbergen from Aarhus. And of course, it's collaborative in the sense that it's not a book that I wrote, but it's a large edited volume with, I think, 22 chapters or something. So it's the work of all the authors that are included in this. And I try to somehow bring the gist of what they have been writing about to the discussion here in this forum. But I also want to, I hope, and I hope the time doesn't run out in the end. I want to bring in a little bit of my current research on the topic of digitalization and the welfare state, which is mostly focused on the level of social policy preferences and how they are affected by labor market risks related to technological change. But I also would like to take this opportunity to just highlight the contours of a research agenda that I see emerging here. And of course, our hope with this volume is that it might trigger an equally fruitful debate as the volume on collective skill formation that Gabriele just had in his hand. And so we'll see what happens. But anyway, so let's start with the more general picture here. Of course, there's historically a very tight connection between welfare state development and technological change. And here's a picture of the Luddites, this social movement that was rebelling against the advancement of machines by destroying them, and in the context of the Industrial Revolution. So even then, of course, the link between technological change and the welfare state was very present and imminent. That has continued throughout the 20th century with the link between Fordism and the service economy, the expansion of the welfare state, the emergence of new social risks. And you could say in the most recent period of heightened globalization and post-Fordism, the emergence of the social investment welfare state was also deeply already related to changes, socioeconomic changes and technological change. So the research question that we are addressing in this edited volume, and also that I'm addressing in my current research agenda, is will the digital transformation or the digital revolution that how many people are calling it lead to a new welfare state paradigm, or is this just old wine in new bottles, so to speak? Is this time really different? Could it be the case that now finally we see a deeper transformation of the welfare state as a consequence of these radical technological changes, or is it just basically history repeating itself? And to foreshadow a little bit our argument here, and here I'm actually in agreement with my co-editors of this book, even though not with all the authors of the book, as I'm going to explain later on. I would say our main finding is that a qualified yes. So we think there are certain aspects of the current rapid technological change that are qualitatively different from previous waves of technological change, and that might really highlight potentially dramatic changes to the welfare state, even though at the moment, actually, there are many other crises that are on our minds. But that's the political economist speaking in me, and maybe also the economic sociologist. Political conflicts and social conflicts, of course, remain crucial. So it's the future is not yet written, and technological change is not deterministic. It really depends on politics and societal reactions. So to start off with a few examples to motivate this idea that this time might actually be different, I chose to start with the example of self-driving cars. Why? Because there's a very important, very influential paper from the year 2003 by David Autor, labor market economist and co-authors. And in that paper, they actually cite driving a car as an example of a non-routine task. And so this paper introduced a distinction between routine-based tasks and non-routine-based tasks, leading to the suggestion that whenever you have a task that is routinizable, so that can be automated, it will be automated at some point, but they explicitly said driving a car is just too complicated to be done by a machine. So this is not a routine task. And then just a few years later, Google already starts with developing self-driving cars. And of course, there are other companies as well doing this. I just pick Google here as one example. And by January 22, these cars have already driven 20 million kilometers on public roads. So they are very present, at least in some states of the US where this is possible legally. We now have self-driving taxis even in some cities like Shenzhen, Singapore, also Phoenix, Arizona. And as you can see in the pictures below, in the beginning, these Waymo cars looked a little bit strange and ugly. And now this is me speaking as a civil servant of the state of Baden-Württemberg. I, of course, have to include a picture of Mercedes-Benz here, just to highlight that, of course, these cars will look like normal cars in the coming years. And you can imagine this is one of these dramatic changes. If at some point there is a tipping point reached where it's technically possible for cars and lorries to drive themselves, and if the legal obstacles are also somehow solved, then this will make a lot of people unemployed very quickly. So this could be a dramatic shock to labor markets. It doesn't have to be like that, but technologically it might be possible. Then another example to drive home the point. A long time, many people said that creative tasks are not automizable because they are so human based and very much connected to human creativity, and it's very difficult to replicate this in a machine. And actually, by now we have advanced machine learning software that can even do that. There was this AI software who wrote a new Nirvana song a few years ago, or 1.5 years ago, and you can listen to it on the internet. It actually, the only thing that they added later on as a human was the voice of the singer, because that's difficult to replicate. And of course, it's not Kurt Cobain, but somebody who sounds like him. And the song itself was played by software instruments and also composed by a computer, and it sounds pretty impressive and pretty decent. The same here with this picture. That was the first picture painted by an algorithm, and now you can, there are lots of software applications out there where you can just have yourself, you can order basically pictures painted by AIs, and it's a little bit of a fun thing to do. But here I just wanted to highlight that this thing was actually sold for over $400,000. So it's not just that they can do that, the machines, but they're apparently also, at least for some people, creating value. Again, I'm not saying that this is necessarily the case that humans will do paint pictures and write all the music in the future. It's just to highlight that many of these technological developments are progressing so quickly that things that people have thought to be impossible to automate a few years ago are now routinely automatable. What does academic scholarship say about this? And here the starting point also of the edited volume is this observation that there is actually quite a lot of research already out there in labor market economics on the impact of not only of technological change on labor markets, but also of the recent wave of digitalization on labor markets. And as is also often the case in social science, there is not really a consensus on what is actually going on, even though some parts of the evidence are, I would say, more robust than others. So on the one hand, there are the pessimists who claim that technological change leads to mass unemployment and inequality. Mass unemployment, not yet, we can say that, but there is quite strong evidence for labor market polarization also in the last 10, 15, 20 years already. And there is a quite interesting paper again by David Autor, and I will have a figure from this paper later on, just published this year in spring, in April or May, so very fresh, where he himself has become more pessimistic actually about the labor market consequences of technological change. And his explanation is that this is largely due to the impact of artificial intelligence, because it's moving so quickly and there is so much uncertainty involved. in what kind of effects AI might have on the labor market in the midterm future, that he is actually getting more pessimistic, even though he tended to be more of a skeptic or maybe even optimist in earlier work. So that's already quite telling. Then there are also the optimists. These are mostly here I do cite papers by Asimoglu and Restrepo or Arns, who basically argue that yes, there will be some job displacement, but there will be new jobs created in other parts of the economy. So at the end of the day, just in terms of the number of jobs, there will be actually net plus out of now. That's not so good. Net plus in terms of numbers of jobs, and not really job destruction. And of course, you could say the quality of employment is also improving if you have better technology that can help, that can take over the not so nice parts of your job, and there's also some evidence for that. So I'm not saying it's all bad. It's a mixed picture to some extent. And then finally, there are the skeptics, also those that are looking at this more from a long-term historical perspective, who claim that this time is actually not really that different, and that the current wave of technological change will lead to some changes in the welfare state, but nothing super dramatic. In the end, it's also optimistic because it means that the welfare state is able to adjust and to adopt. But again, I would say which of these perspectives is the correct one is not a given. I mean, of course, you can analyze what has happened in the past, and we all know that we are in an age of increasing inequality, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it has to go on like this. Political struggles about the distributive outcomes of technological change are, I would say, in the end, crucial. So to give you a little bit of a quantitative perspective on this, this is coming from a paper that that's already some years old, but I think it's still pretty much up to date, and also quite interesting to see. The gray bars are is the number of, or the share of employment in these different OECD countries that is estimated to be at high risk of automation. So more than 70% of the tasks that make up these employment positions are likely to be automated in the coming years. That's the methodology that the authors adopted. It's again Melanie Arns and co-authors. So that's actually not so high, maybe just about 10–12% in countries like Germany and Austria, and it potentially also might have to do with vocational training in these countries. But what you can see here, the blue bars representing those changes in tasks that are at a medium to high level of being automated, 50–70%. So it's still a lot of automation risk for these positions. And this simply signals, even though maybe we don't see mass unemployment coming, we see a significant wave of labor market transformation ahead of us. And this is the evidence of labor market polarization that many people have started to accumulate. It's also from this paper from David Author that I mentioned before, but it's actually coming from a study that was done some years ago. And it shows that it's especially the middle routine task jobs that are reduced in terms of employment share. And it's both the high skilled jobs that are expanding, but also the low skilled jobs, namely those low skilled jobs that are difficult to automate, such as low skilled service sector jobs, hairdressing, security personnel, and these kinds of things, even though security may be something to debate. But anyway, so this is the hollowing out of the middle hypothesis, where the middle share is decreasing and the top and the low income and employment shares are increasing. That leads obviously to polarization and a lot of fear among the middle class that they might end up on the losing side of this. So that's the background of all of this. And now the question is, how does this affect the welfare state, if at all? And here we claim in the volume, and we've done a lot of literature research to find out whether we really whether the statement can really hold. But I think it does, namely that there is really not a lot of work on the impacts of digitalization on the welfare state. So the last radical wave of technological change, how that affects the welfare state, not only in the present, but also in the likely future. And because many of these things are uncertain, we adopt the approach in this volume that we describe as empirically grounded, but also forward-looking. So we're not trying to make predictions in the hard sense, but we are trying to, or we encourage the authors of the chapters to really sort of think outside of the box and try to be a little bit more courageous in making statements about what they think is going to happen in the next 10, 15 years. And this is also why, in the end, we chose the format of an edited volume, because if you do a special issue for a journal, for instance, it will be a little bit more difficult to get more speculative and potentially also more interesting pieces published for reasons that I think most of you are aware of. So that's why we really chose this format of an edited volume. We encourage the authors to really try to think forward what might happen, even though at the moment you don't really see it yet, and how that might affect the welfare state in the long run. And the book has three broad areas. The first area where we look at broader trends, a chapter on labor markets and social investment, how the risk structure of the welfare state is changing. Very nice chapter by Torben Ivers and Philip Rehm. They just published a book with Cambridge University Press on the big data revolution and its implications for the welfare state. And this chapter is basically a short version of that. A nice chapter by Paul Marx on the implications of this for social solidarity as a fundamental fabric of the welfare state and of society, so to speak. And then we have a very large section on politics, the changing politics of the welfare state, how that affects preferences, demands on the welfare state, the gender aspect. We have a chapter on the basic income, which is often discussed in this context, but also the politics of the basic income, basically. And also a chapter on parliamentary debates about digitalization, how political elites talk about it. Oops, sorry. And then we have, that's actually the largest section of the volume, a large section on different policies, because we really wanted to dig into the policy aspects of this. We have chapters on pensions by David Natali, Michele Reitano, Frank Mullmeier, chapters on the platform economy that might undermine labor market regulations and standards or not, according to Georg Picot. A chapter on education, 2 chapters on healthcare, and also a chapter on taxes, because even though taxes is not a social policy, but as you know, tax policy has a lot of redistributive implications, and therefore we thought it's important to have something on this as well. Of course, I cannot really summarize all of this now in the relatively short time I have. So I try to do my best in highlighting a few common themes and questions, and then saying how the different chapters sometimes provide parallel answers, sometimes slightly different viewpoints. And I start with this question of, is this time really different? Can we say that the welfare state is likely to undergo dramatic changes in the next 10, 15 years, or is it more gradual change and incremental transformation? So on the one hand, as I said, there are also good reasons to say, let's calm down a little bit and look at the historical trends. So maybe it's not as dramatic as many people make it sound. And so far, even though we do see real effects of technological change on labor markets, they are not yet dramatic. So there are good reasons to say this would likely lead to rather more incremental rather than structural change of the welfare state. But on the other hand, as I said before, the full effects of digital transformation are not yet there. They are not yet materialized, and it's very hard to predict the effect of artificial intelligence, AI, on labor markets. There's also new work emerging that really connects these labor market transformation processes with political outcomes, quite convincingly showing that there is a connection between the rise of robots and support for right-wing populist parties in different countries, in the US, but also in Europe. So there might be something to this. And also, I would say, if you look more towards the policy side, there are new policy ideas emerging, especially different variants of the basic income schemes. And even though it's not always discussed in the context of digitalization, of course, I would say that this whole tech change debate has definitely given a boost to the debate on basic income, transforming it more from a crazy idea at the fringe towards a quite serious idea, more in the mainstream of economic and social policy making. And I think that's also something that is very important. There are new actors emerging, and I'm just going to come back to this in a second, especially global technological companies that also might affect the fundamental political dynamic of the welfare state. So the chapters give different responses here. As I said, there are some chapters leaning more towards no, saying that this time is not really different, and ran chapters on long-term historical trends of socioeconomic changes. For instance, the chapter by Werner Eichhorst et al. Is also a little bit more skeptic in that regard. And Georg Picot has a very nice chapter on the institutional limits against the expansion of the platform economy. So he basically argues that welfare state institutions are, at least in the countries of Western Europe and so well entrenched that it's, even though there are some short-term effects regarding regulatory gaps in the medium term, he is quite confident that there are quite strong institutional limitations against the expansion of the platform economy, or the fact that it might undermine the welfare state. Leaning more towards yes, so saying this time is really different, is a chapter that I wrote with Ulrich Glassmann from the University of Flensburg. And in this chapter, we look not so much at the quantitative aspects of changing employment patterns, but rather at the qualitative transformation of the meaning of work. So the rise of social skill, social service occupations, which might be an interesting, maybe potentially unintended side effect of digitalization, not so much about the expansion of digital employment in the narrow sense, but in the long term, much more about the expansion of the service economy and the social market economy, or the social economy, essentially. And also, of course, the creative industries. The chapter by Iverson and Rem that I also mentioned is quite pessimistic, in the sense that it's also saying this time is really different, because the digital technology, especially in the healthcare sector, allows for much more fine-grained analysis of individual risks, which undermines the collective dimension of the welfare state, and could therefore lead in the long term also to significant decollectivization of the welfare state. And then in the field of education, this is a chapter by Sigrid Hartung and co-authors who look at the changes in the governance of education, especially related to the rise of global technology companies. Google taking over classroom management, the measurement of educational performance, and so on. So that's also a field, I would say, where we do see significant changes happening. And in the end, I would say, you know, the responses to this question, is this time different or not, is partly a matter of perspective. But also there is substantial variation across policy areas. So I would say in healthcare and education, we see much more significant changes happening, or likely to happen in the near future, compared to, say, pensions, for instance. All right, so coming to the second big question, besides this, is this time different? The second big question is, does it change the politics of the welfare state? And here I can go a little bit more into detail compared to what I said before. You know, and I think there are two different aspects here. On the one hand, technological change could lead to changing power relations between established actors, but also it could lead to, on the other hand, to new actors emerging, and especially the global technology companies with a significant platform power. I would say that's historically unprecedented, what we're seeing at the moment, that there are really a handful of companies that occupying a lot of power in the digital marketplace with little foreseeable opposition to or kind of some kind of mechanism emerging that might balance this monopoly power out. So I think this is potentially something that that has then implications for the welfare state. For instance, if it's very difficult to tax these companies, then it's also difficult to finance the welfare state. And then second aspect, changing power relations between established actors, of course, is getting more difficult to organize workers in a digital marketplace, which is very fragmented and split up. And there might be new cleavages between winners and losers of technological change emerging that are not the same groups as winners and losers of globalization, for instance, or other past socioeconomic transformations. And in the volume, we have these chapters on the politics of pension reform, which are also, especially chapter by Natalie and Raitano, showing different scenarios of how things could go. It could be more or less dramatic depending on the labor market effects of technological change. But Frank Nullmeyer's chapter, for instance, actually quite optimistic in the sense that even Bismarckian welfare states, and he looks at the German case, especially in Austria, even Bismarckian welfare states, he thinks can adopt to this new environment. There's also some interesting contributions in the volume on new cleavages and preferences, especially cleavage about gender is on gender is important here. It seems that a lot of the discussion or a lot of the dynamic that links automation losers with support for right-wing populists is really a story about men and not so much about women. We also see that the winners of this transformation are more likely to support social investment policies, whereas the losers are more likely to support compensation policies, which I will revisit in the latter part of the talk. And I also already mentioned the role of global tech companies in education. And then last big question is, does it maybe expand or change the policy space of welfare state reform? Does it bring new demands? Does it lead to new demands on the welfare state or just more of the same policies? Does it introduce demands for completely new types of policies? And more in the traditional or in the conventional frame, we could say, okay, it might lead to the expansion of social investment, education, and training. That's the obvious policy response here. But alternatively, it might also encourage the expansion of public sector employment. So going back to some of the policies from the 70s, reduction of working hours, I think that's a discussion that is gaining a lot of traction again. And then, as I said, that there might be more new policy, genuinely new policy ideas, variants of the universal basic income, new regulatory policies for the platform economy, where a lot of policy innovation somehow needs to take place in order to manage this newly emerging aspect of the digital economy. And again, there are different viewpoints on this in the volume. More optimistic in the sense that existing policies can be flexibly adopted in the case of pensions I already mentioned, or that they are resilient in the case of the platform economy. More pessimistic, the data revolution in healthcare, education, and taxes. Regarding the UBI, so far, at least that's what the chapters in our volume shows. It's not the case that it leads to overwhelming support for UBI. A little bit of a mixed assessment here. So in the last, what I have, 10 minutes or so, 5-10 minutes, I want to just change track a little bit and talk about my ongoing research on this issue that I'm doing right now, and especially I'm focusing on the last aspect, namely the question of, does it lead to new cleavages in social policy preferences? Here we can draw on new survey data from the OECD Risks That Matter survey, which includes 25 OECD countries with 25,000 respondents. And it's mostly about social risk. It's a great survey. And we were able, together with a team from the University of Lausanne, to include some questions about technological change in that survey, working with the OECD. And so the paper that I'm gonna shortly present here is joint work with Tobias Toba from Konstanz and Mia Gantenberger from the University of Lausanne, Carlo Knotz, who is now at the University of Stavanger. Just got published in the Socioeconomic Review a few weeks ago. So if you're interested in reading the full version, here's the link on the slide. And what we find in this, so basically this is just describing our independent variable here, we are trying to see whether automation risk is somehow related to social policy preferences. And there's a whole big discussion in the literature on how exactly to measure automation risk, and we can maybe go back to this in the Q&A. There are different ways of doing this. Here for this survey, for this paper, we just rely on subjective perceptions of automation risks, which is just maybe not, definitely not the best, but one way of doing this that is also accepted in the literature. And here, this is the share of respondents in the different OECD countries that think that it's likely or very likely that their job will be replaced by a robot, computer software, algorithm, or AI within the coming 5 years. And there you can see, first of all, of course, a huge variation across countries, but also some countries where there are huge worries about this. Korea, 65%, 2/3 of people are quite worried about the impact of technological change. Other cases, Austria, Finland, it's the opposite. Now, obviously, this is likely to have something to do with the welfare state acting potentially as a buffer of these risk perceptions. And interestingly, you probably don't remember the figure that I showed before, but it's not the case that an actual high automation risk is directly correlated to subjective worries about this. Korea, for instance, is a case where objective automation risk is actually quite low because Korea has undergone a lot of technological change already. This is also why people are very worried about it, but actually they don't have to be so worried because it's already passed. Vice versa, a country like Austria, but also Germany, people are not so worried about it, but actually there's quite a high potential for automation in the coming years. So this just shows that the relationship between subjective and objective automation risk is also not as straightforward as you would think. And this is now our dependent variable. What is the preferred policy response of respondents in response to technological change? And here you could also see quite some significance here. It's not so much about countries, but this is the different policy options that we gave them. This is the share of respondents who support or strongly support these policy measures. And the first two ones are about education and social investment, investing in universities, vocational training, further training. C is about the digital infrastructure, so physical infrastructure. D is to introduce a tax on robots or technology companies, which is the least popular policy option, quite surprisingly, actually. Limiting or reducing working hours is also medium popular. And the last two ones are compensatory measures, making public benefits and services such as unemployment benefits more generous. It's option F, less supported than social investment, but of course still relatively high. And introducing a universal basic income is option G, 60% support. So that's across all respondents, across all countries. And of course, we are more interested in the individual level variation here. So we did a factor analysis, and the responses load quite strongly on two different factors, which can be interestingly or quite in a quite straightforward manner related to compensatory policies, or actually we call it in the paper protective policies, because this also includes things like the robot taxes or reducing working hours and so on, which are not compensatory in the strict sense, but regulatory and protective, and social investment oriented. And here you see the distribution of factor scores aggregated across countries, and also a lot of variation across countries. Although in the paper, we are more focusing on the individual level variation, not so much on the country level variation, and we hopefully can pick up the country level variation in a different paper in the future. So the most important finding is here on the left-hand side, which is the multi-level regression for the individual level variables. And the first one is this technological risk variable. It's a little bit of a more, it's slightly more comprehensive than just this item about automation worries that I showed you before. But it's a measure of subjective automation risk. And you can see that people who feel at risk are significantly more likely to demand compensatory or protective policies. and significantly less likely to support social investment policies. And that's, of course, a very interesting finding, also with deep political implications. Those people that are highest risk, they are not so much in favor of those policy responses that would potentially be most sensible, namely to invest in education and research, but rather because they're so worried, they demand short-term measures, namely compensatory measures and protective measures. It's the opposite when we look at technology users. So this is a variable indicating people that use a lot of technology on their jobs, which is of course correlated with income to some extent, also with tertiary education. And here you see the same thing, namely, you could say winners of the digital transformation are more likely to demand social investment policies from the government and less likely to support social compensation. So this is the cleavage potentially emerging between the winners of technological change and the losers of technological change, which is systematically related to social investment versus compensatory policy preferences. Yeah, I don't have time to go into detail about the other control variables here. On the right-hand side, I just want to emphasize that we do add some macro-level variables, spending on active labor market policy, spending on passive labor market policy, occupational change measures, to what extent the country has already undergone a lot of significant transformations on the labor market, and unemployment. So high levels of unemployment in the country lead to more support for these policies. Interestingly, high levels of spending on active labor market policy is negatively correlated with support for compensation, which signals that there are some feedback effects here going on, whereas countries have a tendency to express self-reinforcing feedback in the sense that if you are in a country with well-developed active labor market policy, it's more likely that people also support more of these policies, whereas it's the opposite in the case of a focus on passive labor market policies. And lastly, we do some interaction analysis. This is the interaction between being a user of technology on the job and perception of risk. Why do we do this interaction? So you could say, basically what we want to highlight is that it's not all heavy technology users are the same. There are some people who use a lot of technology who are quite confident that they can evade the negative side effects of technological change and are therefore more likely to support social investment policies. But there are also heavy technology users that are quite worried about technological change, which is also quite plausible because they see the potential effects of technological change every day. And it turns out that here, these were basically parts, the technology users were part of the social investment supporting coalition, the winners of technological change, but there are at least some technology users that are also part of the losing side, in the sense when they are very worried about their employment. So these subjective risk perceptions really basically dominate the impact of employment conditions on preferences, and then you get an emerging coalition of high risk people that are that demand social compensatory policy. So I hope that was not too complicated. I'm of course happy to explain it more in the Q&A. Just to highlight, I don't have time to go into detail here, just to highlight that we also did another analysis of this in a constraint setting, because you could say, well, if you can just say, I agree to all these policies, then I'm just going to demand more of everything. And to address that criticism, we also did a quite similar analysis, forcing people to allocate some kind of funds to different policy responses. So basically they have to make a choice between different policy responses. And in a sense, we get a very similar pattern, or the same pattern, that people who are at high risk of automation demand more compensatory policies, and those in the tech users demand more social investment. This is the emergence of a potentially new cleavage. So to conclude, I think my first thesis here, or my main thesis, I would say, is that technological change, I would say in the current phase of rapid technological change, is likely to lead to significant transformations of the labor market and the welfare state in the medium to long term. maybe it looks, if you look at this more from a short-term perspective, it looks more like incremental change. It might proceed more incrementally. It's not a big one-shot thing, but many small steps. But as we know from Wolfgang Streeck and Kathy Theon's work, even incremental change can add up to transformative change in the long term. And I think that's likely to be the pattern that we will see here as well. And there are quite a number of reasons to why one could say this time could be different, especially the pace of AI development, unpredictability, changing politics of the welfare state, with the rise of global tech companies and new emerging cleavages. One thing that I'm also at the moment working on and very much interested in is the relationship between the digital transformation and the green transformation, whether people perceive differences between the two, whether they want different kind of policy responses depending on whether it's about the green transformation or rather about the digital transformation. And we actually just got the data from yet another survey that we did with support from our excellence cluster on the politics of inequality here in Konstanz, where we ran a comparative survey in 6 different countries to compare really the policy responses between the digital transformation and the green transformation. And so far, we haven't really gotten so far as to be able to provide robust findings yet, but that's something that I'm currently working on. All right, so I think I've talked long enough, and I'm very much looking forward to your questions and comments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marius. This was a very interesting presentation. Thank you for introducing us not just to your published book, but also to your current research. And now I give the floor to Emmanuele Pavolini, where everybody here likely knows him. He's professor of economic sociology at the University of Macerata, and he's one of the most important experts of welfare state and social policies in European sociology. So, Emmanuele, please tell us what you think. Tell Marius what you think about his book. The floor is yours.
Thanks, Gabriele. Thanks, Marius, again. I'll start commenting the title of the book. The title of our book, we've seen it before, is Digitalization and the Welfare State. I think it's misleading in the sense that reading the book, there is a lot more than digitalization and the welfare state. As Marius said, this book is really what I like in terms of comparative political economy, is a mix of how political scientists do research on economic and social transformations, but there are a lot of insights typical of economic sociology as well. And the type of issues that are tackled and studied and analyzed in the book partially go beyond the role of the welfare state, or directly the role of the welfare state in relation to digitalization. For instance, one of the chapters Marius wrote, and he was quoting about how the subjective perception of work and how it changes is, I mean, I must thank Marius. That's something that is really pure economic sociology and written by political scientists. I'm happy about this kind of mix. So I invite others who have not done it to read the book, because there is a lot. There is, of course, the important thing, and this is one of the reasons why we discuss this book, is that the welfare state is seen as one of the major institutions potentially filtering, forward-looking, how digitalization will impact on societies, on politics, and on the labor market. So the part of the welfare states open up, I mean, the analysis open up to a lot of different issues. As Marius said as well, is really a forward-looking book in the sense that, for me, it doesn't provide answers. It couldn't, for all the good reasons Marius said. So in that respect, I was a little bit disappointed when I finished it. But then I thought, well, I could have not expect anything different. We are talking about a huge process, and as it's written in the book, and as we know, a lot of major technological changes took decades before we could see the real impact. It happened with personal computers and technological innovation of that kind in the 70s and the 80s. the changes in productivity really did not happen from one year to another. It was, again, I totally agree with him. Perhaps it's better to use the framework from Schreck and Thielen about gradual transformation than thinking about radical change. So I think the book is really good as a toolkit. So there are many chapters that can be used for empirical analysis now on, and for several years, I think, even more perhaps than years, perhaps a decade, to measure how things change and what is the level of similarity and homogeneity or not among different countries. So in a lot of cases, the chapters, I suggest read them as I said, analytical and empirical tools that can be adopted from now on for research, looking at what changes over time. I just focus, given the fact that I want to just take about 10 minutes and not more, so to leave the floor. By the way, I also invited some of the Italian, all the Italian co-authors of Marius and colleagues' books. Some of them could make it, some couldn't. So I invite David and others who are here just to join in the discussion when they want after I'm finished. I'll focus on some specific points. One of the most, perhaps because I did a lot of studies on healthcare, perhaps one of the most striking chapters, Marius said it, and I didn't know the book has come out, so I'm going to read it right away, is the Iversen-Rem chapter. It's one of the most, in my opinion, fascinating, is about the change of risks. Why the chapter is important? Because it tells us something about risk individualization and how the digitalization and big data can allow to do things about risk pooling and risk individualization in relation to healthcare, which were not possible until recently. In other terms, what might happen is that with an increasing amount of data, it might be possible for insurances, but eventually also for the public sector, especially when it's based on social insurances in relation to healthcare, to create ways of setting premiums which are exactly defined on individual characteristics. So for the first time, big data and how big data are treated could allow to more and more diversify and fragment, in a way, potential users of healthcare services, in a way that there's going to be always more and more a potential direct relationship between how much I pay depending on the risk I have and what eventually then will happen. Why am I focusing on this chapter? Because of course, again, the book is really good in discussing about the politics. And this is a chapter where clearly the last point is going to be, if you follow the discussion by Iversen and Rem, the last point is we're increasingly going to have in healthcare, but potentially not just there, a kind of distinction, okay, between those who have enough information to know they are low risk or exposed to low risk of healthcare risks, and those who have high risks, and they might behave quite differently. No, the only thing that I did not find convincing in the chapter, and I'm sorry asking Marius and not Iversen or Rem, but he's representing the whole bunch of great scholars they got aboard, is age. I mean, they partially discuss about it, but let's call it the politics of aging and how that interacts with all it's written in this chapter is another chapter, is something very important. Because if we take healthcare, on one hand, of course, we know that in many countries, older people are more conservatives. Okay, they tend to vote more often on the right. At the same time, if you look at healthcare, we know that more than half of the likelihood of being exposed to risks increases by age. So I wouldn't be so straightforward as they do in the book, as they do in the chapter of the book, saying that there is such a clear relationship between, I mean, a propensity to vote for conservative parties going in the direction of dividing risks and not, because people have a life cycle. So when I'm in my 30s, I can think I don't need an insurance, as we know. But when I turn 50, I start to think, hey, I start to have friends with cancer, isn't it? Perhaps, and data cannot show that in advance. So again, it's going to be interesting when we're going to have, and probably it's going to happen soon, not just big data on previous healthcare conditions, but good data. And with I'm totally agree with Marius with artificial intelligence. We are there already, predicting almost at the individual level what might be my probability of developing certain type of healthcare risks or other social risks. Now, I took too much time, but I found that the chapter, as many others, very interesting. The other point, in a way, disturbing point of the book is that, and Marius showed it, I think, in his last slide or previous last, when he was talking about the book. If I read different chapters about the politics of the welfare state, so about what might be the type of social policies that will enter in the debate, I finished the book and I got totally different scenarios. So on one hand, there are some authors who argue there are good reasons to think the basic income debate, as Marius said, might take pace. But then in other chapters, and this is something Marius did not say, but I don't know if you'll have time to focus on that. What he says and what other authors say is this complicated thing, which is, let's say you're a working class. I make it more simple than how it's written in the book. Let's say you're a part of the working class. You're at risk of automation and losing your job. The best solution would be, for the medium term, social investments, so education, VET, and so on. No, you ask for social protection. One reason is that often you're already an older worker, so it makes sense. If you're in your 50s, you just need to have enough income. It doesn't make too much sense to say, I've got to do a VET program, and then in 5 years, I get a job. In 5 years, I'm ready to retire. But, and this is the point where it's written in the book, but Marius did not talk about too much, part of the rise of the voters for radical right-wing parties are not just the losers of digitalization in terms of they risk to lose their jobs and they fear they will not receive social protection. There is a dimension which has got to do with identity. So you got, reading the book, this very complicated nexus where on one hand, those who tend to vote for radical right parties because of the risk of digitalization want social protection, so income maintenance. At the same time, they are dissatisfied with this answer. So if you ask them, do you rather have social protection or social investments? The answer is social protection all the way. But then if the other question is, are you satisfied? Do you think the state did enough for you? No, because there is a dimension of identity related to work. So really thinking about the politics in the future is going to be very complicated if I put together these different things. Anyway, so on one hand, we have a debate about social protection, eventually more universal or universalistic. It's about basic pension systems. That's what David and Michele write about. But then there are another set of chapters, like the one from Iverson, Rem, and others, which go totally in the other direction. We're going to have a polarization of the electorate, and half of the electorate will want something which is exactly the opposite of a more universalistic welfare system. They will want an individualized system where there is a clear relation between how much I pay in terms of contribution and taxes and what I get, knowing exactly what my exposure to social risk is. So I know we can't find an answer, but it's such an open question. I mean, at the end of the book, we could go in two totally different ways. I would have hoped that Marius would have used some magic charm or something to tell us with Marx and the others. What do you think it might be more probable, or how much this kind of dilemma between perhaps going more universalistic or going individualistic is going to be highly determined on one hand by welfare institutions, So the type of welfare institutions you got in a country could tell you more about which way you take, and of course the economic structure. And the other part is about politics and political competition. So I would have expected in the conclusion some more analysis arguing it's more probable, it's different, as Oscar Wilde said, the worst thing, I mean, the hardest thing to predict is the future. Of course, it's like that. But I would have expected some hypothesis saying, I would expect in liberal market economies, if I use that type of varieties of capitalism typology versus coordinator or something else, I would expect that given this type of institutions and given this type of political competition system, we might expect that we will go more in a direction instead of the other. I took 5 minutes more than expected, so apologies to Marius, Gabriele, and everybody else, but please, who have not done it, read the book. It's very, very interesting and updated, not just for welfarists, not just for digitalization, social scientists, but more in general for political economists. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Emmanuele. And now I open the floor. Please put on your virtual hand or just intervene.
Gabriele, Cecilia gave to me the floor, so I can manage and give the floor to people if they ask.
Okay, that's fine. Maybe while people think what to ask, I might break the ice with a very fast question, which refers to technological change, actually, because technological change has an impact on institutions, and this is what Marius is working about. But in turn, somehow institutions might have an impact on technological change. Think about the regulation of the way AI might collect data about individuals, and this different possibilities from this in this might have a huge impact on the way digitalization influences the welfare state. So my question to Marius is whether you have been working, you and your colleagues, your network has been working also on this issue. For instance, think about the different ways by which in the past US and the European Union have enacted regulation with respect to the big IT companies. Think about Microsoft and the Netscape Explorer debate. So are you thinking also about this aspect of our issue, Marius?
Yeah, thanks a lot for this question. It looks like a sort of simple question, but it's I think a lot of complexity in there, and that's also partly a response to Emmanuele's first point about the title, where we had these discussions in the editors group, and we said, okay, we have to really narrow it down because otherwise this will get uncontrollable. So of course we discussed also political economy of regulatory policies regarding digitalization, tech companies, and to some extent it also has implications for people's welfare, of course. But we decided we just have to let that sit aside for now, and then and I think actually that part is already quite well covered in the literature. Maybe not so much in the welfare state literature, but there's quite some work on the regulation of tech companies and big data and so on. Another aspect there that is also under research, but also an aspect that we decided to exclude is the relationship between the welfare state and innovation policies, because you could say the welfare state also shapes how countries engage in R&D policies, innovation policies, and there is a little bit of work. I think Darius Ornstein, for instance, is working on this, and some people are working on this more from a political economy perspective. but it's definitely something that it's very important. But we really had to narrow it down, and we said, okay, we just focus on the super simple story. How does tech change influence the welfare state? Even though, of course, we know that there is a feedback mechanism going on, and that this is developing over time. And maybe if I may take this opportunity to also respond to Emmanuel's great points. Thanks also to you, especially for reading the book and for giving such a nice assessment. And yeah, to some extent, maybe it also reflects my own experience with the project. Of course, I also hope that we would come out with very concrete answers in the end. But then during the project, I realized it's just not possible in many ways. But even then, what we actually tried, and maybe we didn't manage to do that as convincingly as we liked, is to get as far as possible, right? So this is why we're saying forward-looking approach, but we're trying to find empirical traces of these forward politics in the present, for instance, by studying social policy preferences on emerging issues, or by looking at labor market trends that are already there, but not yet so dramatic or something like that, right? So we try to just go. We don't want to do simple predictions, but we also don't want to do tea leaf reading. So we want to try to do something in between, and I think the different chapters sort of manage to do that better or worse. But I think that's the thing. And I would say on Iver's Rehm chapter, I think what this chapter definitely does is showcase what would be technologically feasible, right? Whether it's implemented or not, and what the political side of this is. They don't really talk so much about in that chapter. Maybe they talk about it in the book. I haven't actually read it in full yet. But I think your idea of linking this to the generational aspect is a really good one, very interesting one, and it shows that there might be political obstacles to implementing what is politically feasible. If I were Torben Iversen, I try to imagine that for a second, and I think, since I've been working with him for some time, I might have a little bit of a glimpse into his head. I think could maybe say that there is also a distinction between these life course related risks that you mentioned and other risks that are potentially more related to individual behavior. And these the second type of risks, I would say, is more influenced by social class than the first type of risk. And so if you then take the technology argument seriously, you would say, okay, at some point, this technology should also be able to differentiate between genuine life course related risks and then provide an insurance for that, and filter out the other behavior related risks, which then get punished because they are related also to social class, and the rich are less likely to pay for that in the case they can afford to opt out, or they have the technological options to opt out. I think that would probably somewhat be his response, and I think it's a good. It might be the case that this is happening. About populism and identity, you're absolutely right. I totally agree with you, and I do think the general literature about right-wing populism is already very much moving into this direction. Look at the work by Peter Hall, Brian Bagoon on positional deprivation, Thomas Kura, and so on. And especially Thomas Kura is probably the one who's able to link the identity politics argument to this more political economy story. I think some of the work in that area has been done by economists like Karl Frey, the guy who also wrote the famous Frey-Osborne paper. So they are maybe a little bit less attuned to the identity politics issue than political scientists are. So maybe there's a little bit of scope to get these different perspectives together. But I totally agree with you about universalism and versus individualism. I think that's a very interesting point. In the conclusion, we try to make the point. That's the idea of moving as far as possible. To say, okay, we in the end we do think it's moving more towards universalism, because the political pressure of doing this, I would say, is likely to be sufficiently high, and there are some practicalities with Bismarckian systems, growing share of self-employment and so on, that also support this trend. but it's not necessarily a trade-off scenario, because you can have both. You can have both more universalizing reforms, but also more individualization. So if you have more universalizing in a basic protection system, be it basic pensions or be some kind of basic unemployment insurance, you can still top it up with very individualized and risk-specific additional private social policies. And I think that's if I would have to, lay down my chips on the bet, I think that's my bet. I would say we will see both. We will see more universalizing reforms, a more comprehensive basic net social safety net, at least in Europe, maybe not in other places of the world, but in Europe, but also more individualization. And I think that has been the trend for some time, but I think this will be reinforced by technological change.
Thanks, Marius. Again, I invite our colleagues to ask questions, or some of the authors. Davide, please. Thanks for asking, for joining us.
Good evening to everybody. Thank you, Marius, for the insightful presentation. I'm sorry I haven't read yet the book, but I would like to do as soon as possible. And for this reason, also according to the comment of Emmanuele, I want to ask you something more about your analysis, especially because for something that also Emmanuele says about the perspective of the book. The welfare state is seen as a sort of a filter or solution or tool to mitigate the negative effects of digitalization. But it's also, I also see the opposite, the reverse. We could imagine also digitalization as a main concern for welfare state, as a tool to increase the well-being of people. And so, and there are a lot of public policies to use digitalization in this sense. For example, open knowledge policies, investments in infrastructures, or for example, in telemedicine and other stuff like that. I want to ask you if you think that looking at this type of perspective, the more interesting differences could emerge in terms of how countries approach to digitalization, not only as a way to, as a phenomenon that affects somehow negatively societies and work, but also as a way to improve the people's well-being.
David, thanks. There is David Natali, who raised his hand. Is one of the partners in crime of Marius in his edited volume.
Well, first of all, of course, I say hi to Marius and thank you so much for being here, for having summarized the main findings of the book, but also for the opportunity that you gave me, Michele, but also Stefano Sacchi, Guarascio and the others to work in this great team. I have, in fact, a couple of questions. One is a sort of, follow-up question after the research project was finalized. What do you think from a methodological point of view about this kind of forward-looking approach to not just what is now digitalization, but what we expect digitalization will be in a few years and will have an impact on the welfare state as we know it. If you are satisfied, let's say, of the kind of approach that you proposed and you basically suggested to all the different authors about, how to frame, let's say, this forward-looking approach and what are the methodologies that we can use to refer to, surveys, the focus on perceptions and so on as a strategy to anticipate to some extent what could be the social risks in the future. And the second question is more about the interplay between, on one hand, digitalization, but on the other hand, also the other main societal, economic, and contextual challenges that we are experiencing. Some of these challenges, Emmanuele just referred to aging. Aging is a long-term challenge that we have dealt with in the last decades. And you know, the question by Emmanuele was precisely about some sort of interplay between digitalization on the one hand and aging on the other. Two different, very different kind of societal challenges that could in fact interact with each other, both on the side of the policy solutions, but also the policy problems that we are dealing with. But you know, what comes to my mind, it's also, for instance, the interplay between digital transition on the one hand and ecological transition on the other. And again, these are the typical kind of overlapping challenges that can, to some extent, cross each other and lead to not just a sort of multiplier effect on the main policy problems for the present and for the future, but could also represent a sort of, you know, complex game that opened some opportunities for policymakers and stakeholders in order to invent something new for the future. And what comes, for instance, to my mind, again, mixing the different kind of challenges, also in terms of some kind of platforms for policy solutions for the future, is, for instance, the so-called silver economy. That is a different way of thinking about aging, technological change, climate change, and many other things altogether, reinventing to some extent our own political economies, or think that all these challenges are also to some extent opportunities for the future to revise our own economic and productive model. Thank you.
Thanks, David. If there are no further questions so far, I'll give back the.
Maybe let's collect. If there is one further question, we can hear it.
Yeah. So far, I don't see other.
No, okay. Yeah. So Marius, you have about 10 minutes to answer our two colleagues and to conclude. Please.
Yeah, thank you very much. I probably don't need the whole 10 minutes.
Where is yours?
Yeah, with David's question first, yeah, I think that's a fair criticism. And maybe it's actually also due to my presentation, because there are some chapters that are also a little bit more optimistic, but you're right that in general, the book is a little bit more focusing on the potential risks associated with technological change and not so much on the opportunities. The chapter by Buhr and Frankenberg on healthcare, they have something on the positive effects of digitalization on healthcare, contrasting this with the Iverson-Rehm chapter. And we as editors, as something that's coming mostly from Paul Marx, he was always keen to emphasize that there are also positive aspects of digitalization in the delivery of certain social services, especially care services, and also the administration of the welfare state. Hopefully, it might benefit from digitalization becoming more efficient and therefore more cost sensitive and so on. So I think that's a fair criticism that the book as a whole, and me also, tend to look more at the potential risks and not so much at the positive aspects of this. As I said, we do have a little bit of this in some of the chapters, but again, a decision that we made as editors to not fully go into a debate on how digitalization affects the public administration side of the welfare state, because again, that would have been another completely new box, and we already have 22 chapters. So I think there are there's additional research possibilities to see how exactly that affects the administrative side of the welfare state. Even though there are positive and negative side effects, there is also some research now on the role of algorithms in labor market administration, for instance, and that tends to be quite contested, that it might have actually also negative effects as well, because it puts people into boxes that statistical discrimination and so on. And yeah, but I think that's a topic that we only touch upon, but not really delve into greater depth. And so that's a valid point. On David's two questions, on the methodological point of view, yeah, I mean, yeah, again, a fair point to say that we could have gone a little bit further in that regard. So we didn't really spell out in detail how this empirical forward-looking approach would look like. And to be honest, I would have to think much more about it and talk to people about it, what would be possible to do here. And I think that some chapters took up our suggestions in that regard more enthusiastically than others. So we do have some chapters that are more in line with rather traditional approaches in social science research, focusing on just hardcore data and so on. And other chapters are a little bit more indeed forward-looking, more speculative. And in the end, I was happy with the mix we have, because I think it's also good to have some good old social science research in there. But to me, it was very important to have also chapters like yours with the scenarios to think a little bit ahead in terms of institutional dynamics that we're already seeing. And I think this is, I would say, also a chance for institutionalism to come back, because especially also qualitative approaches in institutionalism, because that is something where institutionalist analysis can really add something, because you can see already the trajectories of welfare state development, also institutional development, emerging in the present, and because of path dependencies and so on, quite well in what direction this might go. And Emmanuele mentioned the impact of RIOC, of Writers of Capitalism, on this. So this is still, I think, an open field where one could really apply institutional analysis to this. Yeah, I'm not sure whether this is enough to develop a really fully fledged empirical, grounded, forward-looking methodology here. But I think for the volume, it was at least a good way of framing what we would like to see from the authors. And about the interplay, again, a very valid point. We do kind of pretend that it's only about digitalization and there's nothing else going on. So we are a little bit X-centered in that respect, focusing just on that aspect. In the broad trend overview chapters in the beginning, they are a little bit more focusing on interplays, especially the chapter by Werner Eichhorst, Anton Hemmerreich, and German Scalise, because as you know, if you know Anton's work, it's all about interaction and interplay and so on. So he's very much into this. So that chapter has something on these issues. But as you said, I'm especially interested in this interplay between, also like you, between the digital transformation and the ecological transformation, especially in a country like Germany. This is a very important point. And at the moment, at least from the public visibility, the green transformation is much more at the foreground than the digital transformation. And there are, of course, also important aspects, ambivalencies, in the sense that some aspects of digitalization are really bad for the environment, but also digitalization can, of course, like we've seen here, have a lot of environmental benefits. If all of us would have traveled by car or by plane to meet up for this, then of course our CO2 emissions would be way higher. So I think that's something that I see as a very important research agenda for welfare state research in general, to look at the links between social policy and the ecological transformation. Just today, actually, I think there was a founding meeting of a new group of people that are looking at eco-social policies, and so that's something that where I want to also take my research agenda. As I said, we just got the data from the survey on this, where we have various survey experiments in the survey where we basically ask people, what is your response to, or what are your social policy demands, depending on whether it's about the digital transformation or the green transformation. And I'm interesting to see whether, it's both interesting to see whether there are no differences, because it actually means that people just think about labor market transformation, not so much about the source of this. But it could be interesting to also see some differences. I would say that the green transition is more visible and potentially also more accepted as a source of transformation than digitalization is. yeah, so that's at least what I'm trying to work on at the moment.
Before giving the floor to Gabriele for the conclusions, I expect a future research of yours of digitalization and VET and education system, because I mean, the chapter is interesting, but if I know you, and as Gabriele said, your previous work, I think there is a lot there to investigate a lot more. So I hope to see something on that as a selfish scholar, of course.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, it's also, I mean, actually in this research project where we do the survey, because I feel myself, I have become so much more of a survey guy than I ever wanted. I'm a policy guy in my heart still. So we do have a qualitative part of that project, and actually education is one of the policy areas that we look at, in skill formation. So ask me in a year or two, and I think I'm going to be back in skill formation business.
Okay, thank you, Marius. But next time we will have you in Italy in presence, not virtual. Okay.
Good.
So thank you very much, Marius, Emmanuele, everybody who took part to this discussion. I once again remember you of our next seminar on October the 10th. So have a nice evening and bye-bye to everybody. Goodbye. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye. Thanks. Bye, everybody. Bye.